Good morning. First of all, let me say that in response to what Heidi just delivered, which is both an account of her paper and some addition to its arguments, I'll give you my brief response. Humpty Dumpty is right. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Second thing I want to do is tell you a story, and it's the story of the day I became an originalist. Many, many years ago, when my daughter was 6 years old and we were sitting at the dining room table, and she was not participating in the conversation or eating her food because she was playing with the two dogs, that small dogs that were underneath the table. And I said to her, "Susan, stop playing with the dogs." She raised her innocent hands and said, "I'm not playing with the dogs." And I said, "Susan, stop kicking the dogs." She said, "I'm not kicking the dogs. I'm barely touching them." I thought, I'm the philosopher. She's the 6-year-old. I said, "Susan, don't do anything with the dogs." And she said, "Does that mean I don't have to feed them anymore?" All right. Some of you will recognize this scenario. So here are the conclusions I reached. First of all, Susan was acting, and acting quite successfully, as a pretend textualist. And second, she could have done that forever. Third, I could never have stopped her. Fourth, this is not only a function of the fact that she's smarter than I am, but a function of the truth about language. Fourth, that explicitness is not a possible human achievement. And that fifth, nevertheless, in many instances, we know exactly what others mean, as my daughter understood perfectly what I meant. Now, I want to juxtapose two theorists of interpretation who are usually not thought of together, Richard Rorty and St. Augustine. Rorty's account of interpretation is short. Interpretation, he says, is when you beat the text into a shape that best suits your present purposes. Notice that the purposes are yours and not the author or authors, and that the concern is with the needs of the present and not with the directive or command of the past. This is the living constitution theory. It might seem at first that Augustine's interpretive advice is similar to Rorty's. He asks, what do you do when a passage in the scriptures seems to commend vice rather than commend virtue? And he answers, quote, "You subject the text to diligent scrutiny until an interpretation contributing to the reign of virtue and charity is produced," unquote. I love that. Augustine's interpreter seems as willful as Rorty's, but there's a difference. The reader who works the text over until the desired meaning is produced is moved to do so by what he knows about the author. God, Augustine tells us, has only two messages: love him and love your neighbor for his sake. Therefore, when you massage a verse of Scripture until it can be seen to yield these messages, you are not violating or riding roughshod over the text. You are uncovering its true meaning, the meaning God intended, and, says Augustine, in good originalist fashion, whoever takes meaning out of Scripture other than the writer intended goes astray. Now, in the 17th century, Augustine's disciple John Milton repeats the lesson when he says that the way to get a sure, undoubted interpretive knowledge is to hold that for a truth which accords most with the doctrine of charity. And he illustrates this principle when he explains how when Christ says in the Gospel of Matthew that a man can put away his wife only for the reason of adultery, what he means is that a man can put away his wife for any reason he likes. Milton says what you have to do is read the words not as they might, quote, be vulgarly taken, which would be to read them as if they had been spoken by a common carnal man and not by the wise physician. A vulgar reading would be no less intentional than the reading Milton prefers, for if the words are heard as if they were spoken by an ordinary, low-thoughted person, they will have one clear meaning. If they are heard as if they were spoken by Christ, according to Milton, they will have another clear meaning. The difference will not be between a literal reading and an intentionalist reading, but between two different intentionalist readings. There is no literal reading of these words or any words. There is no such thing as utterance meaning, and there is no interpretation without intentions. That, in essence, is the originalist-intentionalist position accurately reported by Heidi when she quotes Larry, quote, "No set of symbols self-declare the code that it is. It may look like English, but it may be a different code, a Martian language that perhaps uses the space between the marks as its letters, or it may be no code at all, but marks made by wind and rain." Heidi provides the correct gloss, quote, "Given that we do not generally seek to read seagull tracks in the sand, why would we want to interpret the marks put on paper by lawmakers absent a concern for their intentions?" Exactly. But no sooner has she said this than, of course, she takes it back. On the contrary, I'm quoting her, "I would argue if the marks laid down by lawmakers assist us in deciphering the content of our moral responsibilities, then they should be thought to be theoretically authoritative." And she continues, "We are free to invest such marks with a meaning distinct from that contemplated by their authors, if so doing better allows us to act on the balance of reasons that determine our moral obligations," unquote. My first question is, how do the marks or tracks get to assist us? The answer is that they are jump-started into semantic life by the assignment of intention. So far, Heidi is right in line with intentionalism. But the intention she would have us assign is instrumentally chosen. It is not the intention of the producer of the marks, but the intention which, when put in place, will yield a meaning that will assist us to get on with our moral business, as we know it independently of whatever the lawmakers may have had in mind. Now, to say that we are free to do so is surely true, but it should be clear that what we are free to do is make it up by substituting for the actual intention the intention that serves our interests, and that remains the case even when those interests wear the honorific label moral. This is Rorty territory, or if you prefer, Dworkin make it the best it can be territory. Heidi performs this move again when she responds to another of Alexander's assertions that, quote, "To interpret statues construed as mere marks on paper or to interpret squiggles on a gum tree is not to interpret anything." That is Larry's statement. Heidi replies, "We are constrained by whatever squiggly gum moth semantics maximize our moral insights." Now, maximize our moral insights is not an interpretive imperative. It is a moral imperative, and constrained is exactly the wrong word. For if we begin with our moral insights and wish to end with them, and then read them into randomly generated marks, we are constrained by nothing but our ideological political desires, no matter how noble they may be. Says who? Twice Heidi accuses Alexander and Sherwin of simply declaring that to interpret is to seek an author's meaning. She says, "Were it tautologically true that interpretation amounts to a search for authorial intentions, we would be spared a great deal of philosophical trouble." To which I say, God be praised. But in fact, it is true that interpretation amounts to a search for authorial intentions. That truth, however, is not tautological. It is the conclusion to a rational argument. The argument begins with the requirement that interpretation be a serious activity, neither predetermined in its directions or without direction. It must have an object which is prior to the interpreter's efforts. What could that object be? Heidi opts for the text when she recommends, quote, that we invest the authority of law not in lawmakers but in legal texts. But that won't work for the reasons I and others have given. Texts only emerge as texts, as opposed to random marks when an intention has been already assumed or presupposed. Nor can the constraint of interpretation be found in what Heidi calls our moral insights. There are just too many of them, and putting any one of them at the center of interpretation will guarantee that interpretation is another name for politics. The only object of interpretation that precedes its exercise and can stand as a lodestar and an independent goal is intention. It is the engine that powers the enterprise, and the search for intention gives the enterprise point. And it doesn't give much else. The insight that interpretation amounts to a search for authorial intentions is of no methodological use whatsoever. There isn't a damn thing you can do with it. Interpretation is a thesis about what intentionalism is a thesis about what interpretation is, not a thesis about how to do it or a thesis about how good it is to do it. Heidi believes that intentionalism's defense require that it be of help. She says intentional interpretation would prove indefensible if it is either empirically impossible to detect intentions or normatively undesirable to detect intentions. In fact, it is often both, and perfectly defensible notwithstanding. Intentions are sometimes discoverable with a fair amount of certainty, sometimes in dispute, sometimes entirely undecipherable, but that just means that interpretation is an empirical, not a theoretical task. There is no such thing as a theory of interpretation. There could not be any such thing as a theory of interpretation. Law professors and even English professors who spend their lives looking for a theory of interpretation should go home and do something useful. The question of whether in a particular instance we succeed in specifying intention is independent of the question of what the task of interpretation is. We can fail at that task, but that's still the task. If it is true that interpretation is the search for an authorial intention, then that truth is in no way compromised or undermined by any difficulties in pursuing that search. And finally, Heidi is not interested, I believe, in interpretation, but in morality and authority, two topics which make up the bulk of her essay. She challenges Alexander and Sherwin to premise an account of the law's influential authority on their claim that lawmakers possess special expertise, and then she challenges them to extract their intentionalism deductively from such an account or theory of authority, and asks, would a commitment to intentionalist interpretation follow from assigning practical authority to the law? I answer, a commitment to intentionalism doesn't follow from anything, and intentionalism isn't even a commitment if by that word is meant an interpretive option. One is free to accept or object or reject. Intentionalism, the assignment of meanings to marks produced by purposive agents, is just what interpretation is. Any issue of authority kicks in after interpretation has been performed. Whatever account of lawmakers' authority you may settle on, interpretation will remain always what it was. Now, one could object that by severing interpretation, as I have here, from considerations of A, morality, B, authority, and C, legal efficacy, I have rendered interpretation monumentally uninteresting, at least as on a theoretical level. That has always been my goal.